Welcome everyone to the Avid Tech Talk webcast series. These sessions were created for Avid customers and partners who administer, design, use, and implement Avid products. These sessions were also created to help you be more successful with the deployment and use of Avid products. And in today's session, we'll be focusing on Media Composer. In today's session, we'll be taking a closer look at how to troubleshoot common problems using the divide and conquer technique. Today's session is a live webcast presentation. And the session is not designed with polished marketing content. Instead, these sessions are less formal and really focus on providing participants with technical content and as much demo material as possible. My name is Kelly Hoops. I'm a Senior Director in Avid Global Services, and I'm going to be the host of today's session. Today's technical content will be presented by Daniel Huber. Now, Daniel joined Avid as a customer care expert for video editors in our Burlington, Massachusetts location back in 2011. He is currently the subject matter expert for video editors in Avid's Artist Suite of products. And prior to joining Avid, Daniel worked as a freelance editor-producer and has also held editing positions at various news production and post-production facilities. Daniel holds degrees in both broadcasting and film production. He brings a lot of industry experience to today's webcast. We're really excited to have him. He also uses a variety of industry tools to exercise his creative passion and currently creates and produces short stop motion animation films. He can also be found at any given moment taking photographs with his DSLR. So with that, I'm really excited to go ahead and turn the time over to Daniel for today's webcast.
Thank you so much, Kelly. Well, hello everyone. Again, this is Daniel Huber, subject matter expert. Today we're going to be talking about the divide and conquer technique. You might be asking yourself, what is the divide and conquer technique? So essentially, it's simply put, it's just the process of locating corrupt data and then through the process of elimination, finding that problem. We'll move on to the next slide here. I've created a visual tree here to kind of better explain the process of divide and conquer. At the top of the tree, we have our problem. Say this is a media file, a sequence, or even a whole entire media files folder. You know, that's a large amount of data. It's going to be really difficult if we're focusing on all of that data at once. So just to clarify on this chart, green means go. So that means that I am continuing to find the issue within that half, and I follow the green down to the problem. Red means stop, and white means null, that it just hasn't been tested because I am finding the issue on this one particular half. Now that's not to say that the issue couldn't be in both halves. But dividing these things up and looking at them in smaller examples is always best. So let's cut this chart in half. Here you can see we've just focused on the left-hand side of this chart. Depending on the size of the data, you might even need to divide it in half again. You might actually have to divide it in half quite a few times, depending on the size of the data. Once we find a manageable size, we can start rolling out items and pinpointing the issue. Again, you can follow the green dots. That takes us down to the problem file. And at that point, I could either ingest it, just recapture it, retranscode it, just bring it back into its original form. So let's talk about some possible errors that you might use the divide and conquer method with. Some common errors that you might see are listed here. We have core consistency check failures. That traditionally has to do with corrupt media files. PMM, insufficient media. That's traditionally with span clips or just a bad metadata flag. We have assertion failed. You usually get this during launch, and traditionally deleting your MDB and PMR files if you're in a standalone environment will resolve this. And then we have our range specified for dupe is outside range of component. This is traditionally like sequence corruption, metadata corruption, and sometimes a simple rebuilding of the pipes of the sequence can resolve that. And I'll actually explain that later to you, the rebuilding of the pipes. And we have sample number greater than 0. This could have to do with a clip or a subclip or even effect corruption. And then we have exception, MXF mapper. This could traditionally be caused by corrupt project settings. And then we have error saving composition to asset manager. This usually has to do with an illegal character name. And if you're wondering what illegal character names we don't support, this traditionally follows suit with Windows designation. This can easily be found through a search. Exception: movie export from procedures failed. You can find this error during an export. This might have to do with an unsupported resolution, or it might just be corruption within one clip that's essentially stopping this export from happening. Traditionally, when you see this, you're trying to manipulate the resolution itself. So maybe you're going from 1080 to 720, or even from 1080 to SD type. And then we have exception: play pipe, encountered a missing mob. This traditionally has to do with a bad mob in the file. This case is more seen in maybe an interplay environment, but I have seen these errors on a local editor where somebody had been they've received an AAF and bringing it in, and they started seeing issues with it because there was one bad file that maybe didn't have its mob transferred correctly. So moving on, we have divide and conquer that we've been talking about here, and let's focus now on divide and conquer in a sequence. I have a visual display of a sequence up here. It's not a very long one, but it gives you a good representation. If I had to find an issue within this sequence, the first thing I could do is start dividing it up. I could make sub clips. I could just use in and outs and use the play in to out option. So at this time, I would like to demo some divide and conquer within a sequence. So let's go ahead and bring our editor forward here. Now here I have some media that I've already pre-canned. Let me remove some of these clips out of this bin because we're going to be using this bin here in a second. So I have a good sequence and a bad sequence. I do have an example that gives us a core consistency check failure, and we'll be exploring that. But let's slow down for a second here. I just want to give you some tools and some information that when you are going to be using the divide and conquer, just having this info readily available to you and knowing where to gather these particular items will be really useful to you. So first, we have our console open here. At any given moment, the console can report information back to us. It can be used as a debugging tool. So a good idea would be to open that up when you're doing this process. So maybe you can pinpoint the issue. The later versions of the editor, we do give you some information about maybe where you would find the issue within a frame. So we'll take a look at that when we get to that point. So have your console ready. And then we also have our bins. In our bins, we have lots of bin columns that we can add or take away. These will give you really useful information. You might find that the source file itself has an illegal character in it by revealing the source file column in the bin. You can do that by right-clicking up in the columns, or you can do that by going to the bin menu with that bin being active, and then you can just use choose columns. We could add the source file name or any other one of these options. Make this a little smaller. Let's load up our good sequence here, because some of the information that I want you to be able to bring forward is going to be seen when we have a sequence loaded here. I'll zoom in just to one of the tracks just so we can get some information off of these. So we have the name of our clip. The clip that makes up this chunk right here is called light 11112. So some of the information you might want to reveal when you're working in this environment is under your fast menu in your timeline. We have our option for clip text here. This is one of my favorite things in the fast menu in the timeline. You can add all kinds of information to the actual segments in your timeline. Here, we can add clip resolutions. This is a go-to one for me because I would like to know if I have mixed resolutions in my timeline. By adding this, you can see we've added the information for the codec that's being used within that clip. Here we have DNX HD 36, and this is an Avid MXF. And we have corresponding audio with that that's at 48K 16-bit. You can see below this I also have some tone that's sitting at 48K 16-bit. Under that fast menu, under the same clip text options, you can see we have some other information here. We have media files names. And the media file names is really interesting because this is actually the raw media file name that lives in the Avid Media Files folder. This isn't the source name of the clip. Source name, if you had an AMA linked clip that was a .mov, that's essentially the information it would reveal here. So you can see we have balloons.mov and light001.mov. But if I turn that one off, and then I turn on media files names, you can see, you know, this is just a lot of information. It says balloons VO1, which designates it's the video track, and then we have AO1 and AO2. That adds quite a bit of information to those clips, especially if you're zoomed out completely. It's kind of pointless at that point. But just keep that in mind. You can explore the clip text and some of the other options that are available to you in there. It's very useful. Another item in the fast menu is just clip colors. By default, lots of these are selected. You know, maybe I found an offline clip, or I have mixed resolutions. You know, having these options selected will be really useful to you to figure out if maybe you do have mixed resolutions or it's AMA linked. Let's zoom back out here. So, you know, we're going over items that maybe will be useful to you in analyzing the metadata of your clips. We've talked about information, adding it into your timeline through the fast menu. We talked about the console. And let's talk about just a sequence in general. You know, like we're going to start dividing this good sequence up here. Maybe one thing I might want to do is if I feel that there's an issue with a master clip, one of the best things to do might be to duplicate this clip so I don't actually manipulate the original. I can take that duplicate and stick it into my sequence rebuild bin. At this point, I can actually reveal all of the clips that are a part of this sequence by going up to my bin menu, set bin display, and showing reference clips. And by doing that, as you can see, I think I already had it selected, so we'll do it on another bin just to give you the idea. We can see all the clips that are referenced within that sequence. In this case, I have two sequences, so it references all the clips for both of those sequences. So this can add a bit of information, and one of the reasons I told you to throw that sequence into a new bin is just so you don't convolute the bin with a bunch of info. So let's go back here and turn this off. I feel like we can get that to do what we needed it to do. It might have been an order of operations here. There we go. So now I have all my master clips that are available in that bin. Like I said, I might feel that one of those master clips is the problem. And the simplest thing to do might be just to start loading these clips individually into the source monitor. And once I load each clip into the source, I'll be able to actually see, you know, did it give me an error? And actually, like I made note, having the console open reported some information. It gave a core consistency check failure essentially here. And this is exactly what we're talking about here. So I'm like, maybe this is my clip. Maybe this is my problem. Maybe I should try to re-ingest it, recapture it. You know, and I can move down the line, just load each clip individually. And the best thing to do is once you load that clip is to play it back. Because once you hit play, you're telling the editing application to start doing its job with caching these frames. So if it finds a bad frame, it will find it during that caching. Let's clear out our console here so we can get clear information, and we'll try to play this clip back now. It seems to be okay, so let's move on to the next one, and we'll hit play on this one. This clip doesn't give an error, and this clip doesn't give an error. So you might ask yourself, well, you're not playing the entire clip. And that's because traditionally you don't need to, because the way the Avid editing application works is at any given moment, it's caching frames on both the left-hand side of that blue playhead and the right-hand side. And it's roughly around 7,000 frames at any given moment total. So you can imagine that, you know, if it finds the bad frame, it will let you know. We've all probably experienced that in the past. So again, going up to the set bin display and revealing those source files that make up that sequence might be a really good step in just loading those clips individually. One other item that if you're working with a sequence before you start dividing it up and trying to pinpoint that problem, a really simple thing that you might want to do is just clear out your record monitor so your timeline is empty here. Take your problem sequence and you can load it into your source monitor. I traditionally just do the drag and drop method here. And once it's in your source monitor, I mark an in and an out at the head and the tail of the entire sequence. And you can either drag and drop down to the timeline, or you can use one of the hotkeys on your keyboard. So I'm going to stick this new untitled sequence in the sequence rebuild bin here. You can see we have a new untitled sequence that lives here. And essentially this is us rebuilding the pipes of the sequence. It's similar to like a sequence refresh, but you're not telling a particular effect to update itself. At this point, you're telling the editing application, hey, I would like you to rebuild the metadata information that builds this sequence. And it gives you one-for-one information, so it's really useful. I will make note, though, that if you have rendered tracks in your sequence, those items will become unrendered at this point because these aren't associated with that, because this is the part of that rebuilding. That's another good troubleshooting step before you go dividing up your sequence. It might be useful to make a duplicate of it, and then at that point clear the renders out of it and attempt to play it back with the effects sitting as real time, or re-render them. It could be that you've essentially rendered a file that had an effect that went beyond its handles. And maybe it shouldn't have let you do that in the first place, but you could have encountered that. And by clearing those renders and re-rendering, you might be able to resolve that. So let's get down to thinking about dividing and conquering a sequence here. We'll close out this little bin here, and we'll just load up our good sequence. Now I'm going to make a new bin here, and we're going to just call this D and C for a divide and conquer. And I'm going to make another duplicate of this because I'm a big fan of not destroying original information. I'd rather make new information that doesn't have any direct contact with that. So real quick, just so you guys can see, I will increase the font size here to make your life a little easier. So we have our good copy here of our sequence, and say that when we play this sequence back in our timeline, we're seeing a problem. One thing that before you start dividing it up, you might just want to start removing tracks. So we have 4 audio tracks here and 1 video layer. Now traditionally you might be working with multiple video layers. You might have titles on top of these tracks and so on and so forth. So maybe deactivating that track with this option here with the active monitor button, you could essentially just drop it down, play it back, see if it plays back. And you're doing the divide and conquer method, but instead of cutting it in half, you're essentially just cutting the track information down at that point, one by one. Since we made a duplicate of this, it's not going to be destructive because I have my original up here still. As I said, I could start removing these audio tracks too, and then I could play it back now, see if it plays back. I could remove a video track and see if it plays back. And then we always have the undo feature, which is great. I know we've all probably used it many times. So keep that in mind before you go dividing up the sequence. It might be worthwhile to just, try a couple different tracks as active tracks, maybe removing a couple of them. And then again, one other item to keep in mind though, before you go dividing it all up, is rebuilding the sequence, because lots of the times you can just fix the problem by just doing that rebuild, dropping the source and then dropping it into a new untitled timeline. So let's talk about dividing this up. Maybe we have a feature length sequence here that's an hour and a half plus long. That's a lot of information. It could have upwards of 10,000 different cuts in it. That's pretty intimidating. So what we need to do is start cutting that information down. When you have a large measuring stick such as that, it might be best to cut this into quarters or cut it into eighths. It might even be worth to cut it into sixteenths. So one way you can do this is with the in and out. Instead of actually dividing the sequence up or making subsequences, I can just essentially use the play into out button and then only cache half of the thing. Now remember I said it caches around 7,000 frames in total. So if you're working with a feature length film and you've cut out 45 minutes as your first half, at any given moment it's never going to cache all of those frames at once. So it might be better to do a smaller sample size. Now this sequence isn't very long, so this should be a decent sample size. And the whole point of using the in and outs is so I can use my play into out option, because I'm restricting what's being cached at any given moment by using that play into out. If I just hit the play button, it's going to ignore my marks, and it essentially would go past this marker here. But if I use my play into out option, at any given moment, it's only caching the information in here. So if I'm sitting right here and I hit my play and out, you know, it's only going to play this in and out, and it'll always start back at the beginning. So just to give you a smaller sample here, if I'm playing in and out here, you know, it'll essentially just stop at the out point. This is really useful if you didn't really have, maybe you had a 10-minute sequence and you really don't want to divide up the whole thing. You can use the play and out features along with the active track features to start minimizing the issues. One other quick item you can try before dividing up the sequence with subsequences is just to simply right-click in your composer window anywhere up here, and you'll get this menu, and you have the option to hide video. By hiding video, you essentially disengage these video tracks. It's almost like just turning them all off at once, and it would only play back the audio. So that could be a really quick way without even going into your timeline and turning off the activate button here. You could just right-click up in your monitor and hide your video and attempt to play it back. Another thing to do, or another thing to keep in mind when you're doing divide and conquer, is do you have hardware? You know, we do usually have a hardware button that's located here. It looks like gear icons. I currently don't have hardware attached to this, so I do not have that feature available in my timeline. But you could disengage your hardware by clicking that gear icon, and it essentially would stick a red circle with a slash through it, which stands for a no sign, or it toggles it off. So once you toggle it off, you could attempt to play it again and see if, you know, your hardware is maybe causing an issue with trying to decode some of those frames. So let's go into actually dividing this up now. You know, let's clear our ins and outs, and at this point, I don't even want it loaded into my record monitor. I would go back to loading it into the source. And I can take the first half of this sequence and drop it down into my timeline. So by doing this, you know, I've created a subsequence of that. It's not the entire sequence. I could start dividing this up even more. Now that I have, you know, I can call this half, and then quarter, and so on and so forth. Or you could use any naming convention that you want. Keep in mind, use your bin columns to make sure that, you know, if you wanted to figure out what type of metadata is belonging to that sequence, you go to your set bin display, show your source files, and start revealing some of your columns in your bin if you're thinking that it might be a particular clip. So we have half of our sequence here, you know, and maybe I'm like, well, this is still kind of quite a bit. So if I clear out my monitors and then load up my half and then cut this in half, you know, we'll get to our quarter essentially. So by doing this, we're minimizing the amount of information we have to look at any given moment. If you keep cutting this down, you know, and then you add your clip text information under your fast menu here, that can be really useful because you have such a small measuring stick to focus on that it'll be a lot easier for you to pinpoint the issue. So we've talked about, you know, divide and conquer and some of the information you can reveal for yourself and how to essentially divide up the sequence to pinpoint the issue. But we haven't really focused on, hey, well, show me the error and show me how you do it in a real environment. And that's what I would like to do with you now. So in the meantime, I'm going to actually just get rid of these sequences because we don't need them anymore. And we're going to load up our bad sequence here. Now I have a sequence. I've used my clip color information, and you can see I have green dots on these clips. And if you're troubleshooting an issue, one thing that you might want to keep in mind is that how can I, you know, figure out, are these clips different than the other ones? Here we can see that, you know, these are PAL clips. They're 24 frames per second, and they're 1080i. If I just simply try to hit play on this track right here, it's a possibility that I could get an error when it gets close to one of these clips. Now, for the troubleshooting purposes here, you know, I can try to load one of those clips, and I would get a core consistency check failure. I don't want to actually focus on loading those clips because in my previous testing, I found that the editing application starts to fill its RAM with bad frames, and it becomes a problem, and I essentially have to clear out my bin memory. And one way that you can do that when you're working in the editor, if you're trying to divide and conquer an issue, is by going to your info tab and just using the option to clear bin memory. This will essentially save all your bins and close them all out, and it will essentially flush the cache out of any information. this can be really useful because if you feel like, you're working with a problem file, and problem files cause problems. It's the nature of them. So keep that in mind. And it's really useful to when you're troubleshooting the issue. Maybe you want to clear it out and only open up the bin with that bad info in it. So let's move on, because there's some more divide and conquer I want to talk about. Real quick before we move on, I'll bring back our PowerPoint here. And I just want to talk about some items that we kind of went over within divide and conquer in a sequence. Clearing renders, re-rendering if need be, using the play into out option, and using the ins and outs in a timeline or a master clip itself, showing reference files, loading each clip individually and hitting play, turning off your active monitor tracks, and removing tracks in general, adding the clip text to reveal information, adding bin columns to reveal information, again removing the audio and video layers one at a time, and then rebuilding the play pipes. These are all things that we discussed, and just keep those things in mind. And if you're wondering to yourself, well, how can I essentially negate some of this corruption from possibly happening in the future? It's digital information. It's ones and zeros. Sooner or later, something will turn from a 1 to a 0. We can't always control it. But, media management is a really good tool to kind of mitigate any of that any problems that you might encounter. Having a sequence bin versus having a bin that has sequences, group clips, AMA files, and every other piece of metadata you could think of Avid could make in the same bin. Because if you're working in a feature-length project and you got 3 bins, but you have 100 master clips and 500 effects, you can have problems by not dividing that information up into its designated area. So now let's talk about divide and conquer and maybe a media files folder. That's the cool thing about divide and conquer. It can be used for many different things. Right now we're going to be talking about media files, but I want you to keep in mind you could use this for an Avid project folder also. If you feel like you have a bad bin, you could always utilize your Avid attic and pull one of your previous bins that had been saved in the attic to replace that bin. You could create a new project and start moving those bins into that project one by one, and then launching the editing application and seeing if that particular bin is the problem. That's the cool thing about the Avid editing application, is traditionally our files, we know them very well, so even if you wanted to move one of those files off to a desktop location to do a test, you could double click that file. It'll launch the editing application and you'll be at the project selection screen and you can make a new project. It'll already open that bin as soon as that project is created. Just keep in mind to keep your frame rate and raster size the same as the project that you were taking that bin from, just to essentially negate any issues that might arise from that. So we're talking about media files folders here. In an interplay environment, an ISIS environment, we have a workspace. We maybe have many workspaces, and each one of those workspaces houses an Avid Media Files folder, an MXF folder, and then the client folder. Here I'm in a standalone environment, so I will have numbered folders, not client folders. In an interplay environment or an ISIS environment, shared storage, they would have their client name, like editor01.1. And the .1 essentially is similar to what you will see on my editor with my numbered folders. We just designate the computer that essentially created that file. In an interplay environment, they don't use database files, so some of that information that I'm going to be talking about might not be useful to you if you are in an interplay environment. But you can use a resource like a media manager along with Avid Access, interplay access, to start finding maybe a corrupt clip by revealing some of that bin information and then finding it in Access and maybe finding if you can recapture it or not. So in our media files folder here, we're on a standalone environment, so I do have MDB and PMR files. And when you're doing a divide and conquer with a media files folder, the first thing that you might want to do is just simply delete those and relaunch the editing application. If the editing application is already open, it's okay to go ahead and delete those, because as soon as you bring the editor back forward, it'll realize that it needs to rebuild those files. So let's open up one of my Avid Media Files folder here. We'll go to our demonstration. So I have a media files folder here. You can see at the top here we have our Avid media files folder. And in there I have my MXF folder. And inside the MXF folder you have numbered folders. Now traditionally the Avid editing application will create a new numbered folder after it hits a limit on file. I have also seen this happen on sizes too. You know, I have seen some of these files be over 100 gigabytes though, just to keep that in mind. One great thing when you're doing a divide and conquer here is there's nothing wrong with creating a new folder. Just as long as it's another number that's not already being used, you'll be fine. So you can do upwards of 3 digits. So if you wanted to even call it 111, that would be fine. Say if we wanted to divide and conquer this folder here. I've already trashed these files, but I'm still seeing an issue. Here are some things that you can start utilizing for information to roll items out. You've noticed that this issue's only cropped up over the last week. Last week, we ingested a bunch of media from some new cameras. All that media was brought in on a certain date. It might be best to find all the media, say they were all brought in on the 6th here. So I could essentially take all these clips that are captured on the 6th, and luckily I don't have too many, and I could move these into another Avid media files folder. I could cut them and then paste them into my new folder. And right now there is no database file in here, but just to demonstrate how the Avid editing application would rebuild that database, I'll bring the editor forward. So here you can see it's already scanning that information. It's scanning the number 1 folder because I essentially removed information from that, and the database realizes that the information in its folder has slightly changed, so it needs to rebuild. So that'll rebuild that one first, and then it'll move on to creating a database for my 111 folder. I'm not going to sit here and watch this, but now that you've seen that it does do that process even with the application still open, maybe you'll have a better understanding of how you can troubleshoot some of these issues. And if we leave this up, we would see that the database will just be created in here once I refresh this in a few minutes. So if I find that there is a problem here, and you know, I'm going to show you something as soon as this database gets built that's a really useful tip that most people are not aware of. And I'm going to give you a disclaimer now that the thing I'm about to do is not something I would take lightly, and if you're going to do it, I would create a brand new project, and this project, the sole purpose of this project would be to troubleshoot these media files that maybe you're trying to divide and conquer out of a media files folder. You might be thinking to yourself, is he talking about the media tool? No, I am not talking about the media tool, but that is a very useful tool to essentially reveal master clips and rendered files and so on and so forth to find essentially a problem file. So you can see here we've gotten our MDB and PMR files now. Let's bring the editing application back forward. You can see that it's finished rebuilding that database. So if I go ahead and load up my other master clip here, this is essentially the trick that I'm going to show you. And it's not magic, and the hand is not quicker than the eye, and I'll do it nice and slow for you. So let me minimize this one real quick. So in our database folder here, in our MXF folder here, we have a database file. This database file houses all the information that is in this numbered folder. And you can actually take this mmmob.mdb and load this into a bin. Yes, that's what I said. You can take this file on an OS level and drop it into a bin, just like this. And like I said, I would suggest doing this in a project all by itself because you don't essentially want to cause any problems within another project. Especially if you were like, oh, I need this clip, and let's transcode it into this other project. You're going to create new information within the metadata of that clip that's going to say, hey, this clip's now associated with this project. So if you did use the media tool to find that, it might tell you that it's associated with the incorrect project. So this is a test. I don't mind doing this all within my project. That's essentially why I had done it here. But yes, so I've dragged my MDB file into the bin, and I can start loading up each one of these clips. Another great thing I can do is within these bins, if I wanted to reveal where this information was on an ISIS workspace or on my local client, I can simply right-click it and use the reveal file option that you can see right here. So we'll click reveal file, and it essentially opens up our database, our Avid Media Files folder, MXF, and numbered folder where that media is located. If there's audio and video associated with that clip, once I bring my editor back forward, it'll ask me if I want to reveal the next file, and so on and so forth. And I can continue to do that until I've revealed all files. So if I was working with an XDCAM clip, I might end up loading up or essentially revealing 9 different files if I had a data track included with it. So you could have 1 data track, 1 video track, and then 8 audio tracks. And that you could essentially have 10 different files for 1 master clip at that point. So keep that in mind. Sometimes it's worthwhile to go the whole ways to the end and make sure it revealed every file. And by doing this, by loading that MDB file, I can do that similar process what we talked about with our sequences, where we loaded each one of those clips individually and hit play. You can use the play into out option to find a problem within one of those master clips. This is a really useful tool. Going back to the editing application now, one other item you can do is once you've loaded your MDB, or even if you've used the media tool in a brand new project and you were looking for orphan media, just as long as you have media in a bin, you can utilize the console to drag and drop clips into the bin itself. Let's close out of this real quick. If you can see here, I can end up dropping each one of these files in here, and I'll make this a little bigger here just so we can see. So you can see it's loaded some information for me. It tells me how many tracks are associated with that master clip. It tells me the name of the clip. It shows me the location of the import path of the source file. It shows me some metadata. This information is probably not very useful to the average user, but one thing I can make note of is it does tell you the frames per second, and it tells you the length of the clip actually. So those are things that you might be interested in. There are these 2 items here when you drop one of those clips into there. You might notice that, oh hey look, my audio is sitting as a different frame rate, or it does tag it as a 2 frame length longer than the video clip. So those are things that you can essentially utilize the console for, is to reveal more information about those clips. You can do this same thing with a sequence. So if I took my sequence and I dropped it in the console, it'll essentially tell me all the clips that's associated with it. You can see here it's quite a bit of info, and this isn't even a long sequence. So imagine if you did have a feature-length sequence, there'd be quite a bit of info in here. Now again, this is not a lot of info that might be useful to you, but if you were wondering, maybe you could dump this out and start searching within the Word document, because it does create a log file. You could find out if you do have mixed rate clips, if you were just interested in finding if maybe your mobs matched up correctly. So that's pretty much, one way to utilize dropping an MDB database into a bin to start revealing those files that you might think that are a problem. Let's bring our Avid Media Files folder back here. So say, we found the problem, and you might be saying, well, doesn't Avid quarantine media? And yeah, it traditionally does. It's really good at actually finding problem files during the database creation. But that's not always the case, especially, there's generational loss if something's been moved many times. You got to keep that in mind. The header of the MXF itself might be fine, but when we try to essentially decode those frames or uncompress them to play them back, that could be where the issue lies, where the header and the information in the MXF is fine, but one of those frames essentially has gone bad. So divide and conquer can still be useful. You might find that when you tried to load that database, it might have given you an error. It might even tell you that there's a particular file that it's not able to load, and it would report that information into the console. So we've talked about divide and conquering a media files folder slightly here. Just some information within the metadata of these clips. So here, lots of people were like, well, this just looks like a bunch of nonsense to me. Well, it pretty much does. You're correct on that. But things that we can think about when we're trying to find out if this is a video track or audio track is we traditionally do designate them. Here it says V01, which is the video track. We have A02, A01, it's the audio 1 track and the audio 2 track. And then we have our size. Audio is traditionally a lot smaller than video. And if you were sorting things by maybe size, you could essentially sort everything by size, find all your audio clips, and maybe divide and conquer those first and leave the video clips there, just to give you some ideas. Excuse me. So now that we've talked about divide and conquer in a media files folder, I don't want to also forget about projects in the Avid Addict. Here I'm in my Avid Addict, and if say I was dividing and conquering a projects folder, the first thing I might want to do is make a copy of all the bins that are in that project and create a new project and start moving those bins into that new project one by one and accessing it to see if I can pinpoint the bin. If I find that bin, the next place I want to go is my Avid Attic. And in our Avid Attic, we have all of our essential bits and pieces, and every time that we've auto-saved or every time we've hit Control-S, essentially one of these files will be thrown in here. And in the editing application, there is a setting that you can tell it how many of these you want to save, or how many times an hour you would like to save it, or essentially how many times in 10 minutes, 15 minutes do you want it to auto save. And essentially when it's doing that process, it'll put a copy in here. Something I want to make note of is a lot of people don't realize this, and there was an old method of when you take one of these files and you bring it into your bin, you would change the .3 to the .avb designation, which would stand for Avid bin. If you look in an Avid projects folder, you can see that we have one right here. We have our Avid shared projects and our divide and conquer that we're currently in, and then we have our ABB files. So if I was trying to replace one of these with something from my attic, I actually don't need to change that .3 or the .2. I can actually just place that file in my project, and Avid knows its own files. It'll instantly become available to you within the application. So like right now, we are sitting in our divide and conquer project. So if I went and opened up my shared location and accessed my Avid Attic, I could find my divide and conquer in my attic, my divide and conquer project in my attic. And once I found it, if I felt like I wanted to replace one of these bins because they seem to be giving me a problem, maybe it's having an issue with just one file in there, what I could do is come back to my attic and grab one of these files, and I can just essentially drag it and drop it in here. Now I didn't change it to a .avb, but like I said, Avid knows its own files. So if I bring the editing application back forward, you can see it's already here. It didn't load anything, it's just here. And I can essentially access this. Now, I mentioned before about creating a new project and slowly bringing bins over there. I like that method better because I could just continue to load corruption within this project. And this project could essentially become a problem so much that it's not usable anymore. So using the method of creating a new project, moving things in one by one is best. If you really feel like you have a really deep-rooted issue. If you feel like, oh no, this bin just gave me an issue, I was working with it 10 minutes ago and it didn't have a problem, going back to the other bin in the attic might be useful. So I hope that was informative. You can still use the play in to out when you find these media files. You could use the media tool. You could drop the MDB file into a bin. You can rebuild your databases. And again, managing your media can help prevent corruption in general. So let's go ahead and bring our PowerPoint back forward here. So here are some links that are useful. These are going to be added into the KB that we create. And these are all essentially links to errors that I had shown you in the beginning of these slides. So if you are curious, or if you do have one of those problems and you'd like to know some more information on it, you can use our Avid knowledge base to search for those error messages. So let's move on to the questions and answers section here. I see that we did have a couple questions, so let's jump right in here. So the first one, let me read it first and then I'll reword it here. So this individual is asking, the method I was shown would be best when running on an interplay environment. So the answer here bluntly, no. I mean, like I tried to make note that when you're in an interplay environment, it's probably best to speak with your media manager before you go doing any kind of deletes within that environment. You can still utilize the bin and revealing information and finding where that clip might live. You can do all of those things still in an interplay environment. Before you take that final step and go deleting things and items like that, you really might want to talk to the admin and tell them what's going on, or even possibly give support a call, because we don't want you to have problems. We want you to be working. So, and if it's corruption of some sort, there might be a deeper rooted cause there. Maybe you have a setting on a third-party transcoder or something that's creating bad mobs. That's something to keep in mind. But you can use some of these things within an interplay environment, but just take caution before you go doing any deletes. And obviously, if you're not an admin, you wouldn't be able to delete them anyways. But, and just in general though, you know, the media files folder and cutting things in half, obviously you're working within a media indexer environment in an interplay. So at that point, you're not going to just create new workspaces and new client folders and move items over. It goes back to speaking with your media manager. Maybe you've done your due diligence and found the problem media, and then you can pinpoint him to that and have him maybe remove it and recapture it, and so on and so forth. So I have another question here. Does shared storage have MDB and PMR files? If so, does deleting them have any effect? So yes, shared storage can have those if it is essentially a non-interplay environment, because in an interplay environment we use the media indexer essentially to build those databases within the media indexer server, whereas if you're in just a shared storage environment with local editors that don't have interplay, they do have databases. Now if one client goes and deletes his database and another client was actually utilizing some of that media per se, he actually might need to relaunch his editing application at one point. So this is where it can kind of become a domino effect, where if one of those shared storage clients who does have MDB and PMR files goes in there and deletes one of those files, the other editors are essentially going to probably see that media go offline because there's no database for them to pull from at that point. But then we have bin locks and things like that. So that's information that you would be able to visually see within the editing application to be like, oh, look, this person's accessing this right now. You know, maybe I should communicate with them that I'm having a problem and I'm about to trash some of these databases. And I got another question here. This is how to troubleshoot the frame corrupted clips because recently, okay, so they faced this issue within an ISIS 5000 environment. And they felt like maybe this was multiple hard drives that had failed. You know that, so let me reiterate this a little bit differently. They essentially have frame corrupted clips, and they feel like it possibly could be multiple failed drives. And I don't think you'd be off on thinking that. But one thing to make note, if you are in an ISIS 5000 environment, you know, we have pretty good metadata and problem tracking information in the web GUI for the ISIS itself. So it might be worthwhile to see, are these drives failing? And if they are, how many are failing? And are we in a RAID 6 environment? Are we in a mirrored environment? How many crates do we have? Are they, you know, do we have one storage group across multiple crates, or do we have multiple storage groups across, you know, multiple crates? Those are all items to keep in mind. And if you do have failed drives, the ISIS itself reads and writes in chunks. You know, that's one of the ways that we get the great bandwidth that we get with that shared storage. So, you know, if you have failed drives and one of those drives is having a problem trying to read those chunks, it could turn your media into Swiss cheese. I've seen it in the past in an example with like a striped RAID where one of the drives had failed. and they were just continuing to work because they just couldn't do anything else, and they had essentially black spaces within their video files. So just be careful with that, and maybe it's best to, if you are in a RAID 6, to think about moving to a mirrored just so you have backups. So I have 2 more questions here, and then we'll end it there. And we have one from Victor. It's what are some of the most often encountered errors for which we can use the methods presented? I'd say core consistency check failure. That's probably the most common one. Another one that I mentioned would be, I believe it's the one that has the MXF mapper and the sample number greater than 0, or the range specified for dupe. Because those traditionally are like handle issues or issues where there's information that's lacking from the clips. And if you wanted to pinpoint that one particular clip, you could do that. I'm glad you asked that question too, because it made me think of something that I didn't mention to you folks. Span clips. Lots of cameras write in chunks, and they have span clips. I've seen a lot of these problems get rooted from errors within those spans. And one way that you can figure out how to negate that problem is, if you see it in the editing application, let's confirm that we see it outside of the editing application. If you're working with XDCam, Sony has a great program, Catalyst is now what they call it, that you can essentially review your footage, you can transcode it, flip it to different media types. And then, Panasonic has a similar application that lets you view the media and stuff. So you can check spans on things outside of the Avid, just to maybe think, if you're thinking to yourself, is the editor causing this problem, or is the clip generally just corrupted? So yeah, those are most of those errors that I mentioned in that one slide can be used for that, though. So keep that in mind. I mean, you can use this for all kinds of things. Somebody wants to know, can I define the term mob? Simply put, you could think of it as like the social security number for the media file, or the home address for it. It's essentially metadata tagged information that is unique to that clip. And there's master mobs and there's mob IDs. And if you're really interested in learning more about that, I would suggest going onto the forums and reading up on it. And those are pretty important bits. And I'll be honest, you're not going to ever really have to worry about them unless you're most likely working with some third-party transcoders, or if you're in another application where you've brought AAFs in and you're going to be rewriting that media as a new codec or a new file, and it possibly could lose those mobs during that export process from the third-party application. It could rip them out of the metadata, and they would no longer be available to you when you bring those clips back into the Avid editing application. So let's turn it over to Kelly here, and again, all these questions and all the answers will be supplied within the KB.
Okay, hey, thanks, Dan. And thanks so much for conducting today's Avid Tech Talk session. Again, any questions that Dan was not able to answer will be sent out as a follow-up email in the next few days after Dan has an opportunity to document and answer each of these questions. And we really hope you found the information today valuable and useful. As we plan our next webcast series, we really want to make sure we include topics most valuable to our customers. So while we wrap up this webcast, we have a huge favor to ask everyone. Jeff is going to be sending out a survey link in the WebEx session, and we would like to ask each of you to take just a brief minute to give us the feedback on today's session. Looks like it was just sent out, so again, if you go to the chat window, there's the link. It's a really brief survey, and in the survey, you will be able to also give us feedback on other topics you would like covered for future Tech Talk sessions. That's really important to us right now as we're looking for some topics for our summer session. And then again, the feedback on today's session is also useful, so we can continue to make these as valuable as possible for you, our customers. Also, if you found today's session useful, we also suggest additional training options to help you even be more successful with Media Composer, both from an operational perspective and a technical support perspective. And I just want to go through some of these options with you just real briefly. I'll go quickly, but again, it's important that you know that these options are out there so that you can be more successful with our products. Our user courses cover the basics in the one-on-one courses for new editors, right through to advanced effects, compositing, and color correction techniques. Course outlines can be found on avid.com/training. And these courses are offered by our professional learning partners, and so you can find one near you at avid.com/training. Just select Training with a Learning Partner to find a location close to you. If you're interested in sharpening your Media Composer technical support skills and even earn a Media Composer support certification, we have the new MC400 ACSR Media Composer System Support course. This is a brand new course. We rewrote it from the ground up, replacing our old CS400 ACSR editing support course. And it's now a blended course allowing you to self-study on your own time and then attend 3 days of classroom instruction with hands-on practical exercises that cover installation, configuration, maintenance, and troubleshooting techniques. If you choose to take the exam on the last day and pass the exam, you will become an ACSR Media Composer Support Certified. This is an industry-recognized certification giving you access to the ACSR discussion forums, Avid certified logos for use on business cards and email signatures, and a continuous e-learning updates for each product version that we release. The Media Composer 400 ACSR System Support course is offered regularly as a public class in our training facilities in Burbank, Burlington, Massachusetts, Pinewood in the UK, Munich, Paris, and Singapore. And again, our public training schedule is posted on the avid.com/training website, or you can also email training@avid.com for more details. So again, we want to thank you for taking the time to attend today's Avid Tech Talk webcast. We hope you found the information valuable and useful. Please definitely visit the Tech Talk registration page to register for additional Tech Talk sessions. New sessions will be posted regularly, so please visit often. You'll also be seeing an email request to take a survey here in the next few days. It's actually the same survey that we just sent to you. So if you took it today, no need to respond to that survey twice. But if you didn't get a chance to take the survey, please take it right away, or definitely take it when you get that email reminder to take the survey in a few days. And with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up today's session.